pop into your head?
Two networks.
Cool. Yeah.
Two different networks.
Yeah. And why might that be bad?
If you're wired and wireless, you can create a loop or just open.
Yeah, that's a good example. You could make like a broadcast.
Yeah. Or open a network that shouldn't be open.
Hey. So I used VLANs in the title, but in reality, you could expand the scope of this just to be networks in general. I find that conceptually VLANs are something that beginners can understand, so I use that as the jumping off point, but we can definitely generalize it. We'll take a look at it from a red team and a blue team perspective for this talk, explain what they are, why we use them, when we're doing red team engagements, how they are obstacles to our lateral movement, and some very clever ways we can get around them. An example, I own an InfoSec company that provides services on like an ad hoc basis, and an engagement that we had last year, actually we used this. So it is applicable. And we wrote a software tool, at least for Macs, that can detect when network bridging is occurring on a per device basis, and it will shut down the extra interface. So what are VLANs? Virtual local area networks. What they do is allow us to split networks up logically. We can group hosts together by their VLAN ID, which is this right here. So your switches will assign it and route frames based off of that. They're informally called tags. You will also see in like layer 3 routing, routers might touch this too, but generally speaking, this is happening at the switch level. So why do we need them? That logical grouping is more or less the gist of it. Even if people aren't physically in the same place, we might want to group them for security or access control reasons. It is also very important to use VLANs on enterprise scale because a LAN is a broadcast domain. So if you have like 255 Macs on a network all shooting bonjour at each other, you're choking up the network. Let's see here. Oh yeah. And as an example for security, if you have IP phones, you might put them in a VLAN separate from your domain controller because there's no reason for those things to be talking to each other. Separating things by like data sensitivity is another common use, just as a backup in case some of your software controls fail. So we know why we use them, but how can we defeat them from a red team perspective? I like to pick on Cisco quite a bit because they have this habit of making their own proprietary protocols full of holes like security Swiss cheese, and then they just abandon them. Those R134 routers that I had a few demos ago, they killed off product support and they didn't patch them, even though they could have. They left them vulnerable on purpose.
Wait, those like products, aren't those products that like companies still use to say?
Yes, I got those from my company. We were doing a rip and replace.
They're inside the network, so it's
yeah, it just burns a little more. So even though you might think they're not really going to leave this stuff enabled, right? They do. And people might not even realize that it's on active if they're not using it. So some protocols that fit that criteria are dynamic trunking protocol and link layer discovery. Both of these are excellent ways to jump VLANs, network segmentation in general, if they are turned on. So we can let Cisco screw up another protocol, or we can use tools like Yersinia. I love Yersinia. Essentially, what it allows us to do is is lie to the switch about what kind of device we are. So switches can operate in different modes. You can have trunking or access mode, and it essentially restricts what the device on that port is allowed to do. And we can leverage that. In Yersinia, we could say modify our VLAN tag. Instead of in the 10, we are now in the 20 or the 30. And if a switch with poor security controls sees something like it's in the 10 VLAN on all its ports, and then you say, well, actually on the 20 Ethernet frame, it's going to forward it to the other switches because they might have the 20 VLAN. So now you have popped out of that network segment. Better switches won't do this, and if they do see you doing it, they might lock down the port or just blacklist your MAC address, things like that.
If the port is at like access mode too, that'll work?
I believe trunking.
It has to be trunking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Trunking. And there might be implementation flaws where it's in access mode, but you send it the frames anyway,
Yeah.
and it does stuff with it. Engagement we had last year. This is a very simplified diagram of what we had going on. So they had wired and wireless networks, and they were performing segmentation using VLANs. Now, if you have been red teaming for a while, you know how important domain controllers are. If an attacker gets access to your domain controller, you more or less have to assume the compromise of everything below it unless you have the logs to prove otherwise. So we had mapped out where the domain controller was on the network, and when we attempted to log in, it appeared that an RDP service was not listening. And this was counter to intel we had mined from their emails. We initially landed on a fabrication computer, and one of the IT people, I guess, troubleshooting something, logged into their email, and we're communicating back and forth. So we knew that the DC had RDP listening, but it was probably scoped to wire only. But we were on a wireless device, so how do we get around that? So the method I like to try and break out of restrictive hosts like this is to look for laptops because they're so mobile, right? Even if conditions aren't great for attack right now, down the road it might be. What we wanted was a laptop connected to Wi-Fi that was likely to be hooked up to wired internet at some point. And in most enterprise environments, people use docks, and a lot of the time they are wired up. So we decided to look for a device that would do that and wait. And as many of you might know, if you've been to a few of my talks, I'm pretty heavily into the Apple side of things. So Bonjour, like I mentioned earlier, is a great way to discover hosts on the network because they will just literally broadcast to each other what they are, what services they have available. And by default, on Macs, it's named after the first user on the who set up the device. So even though you have Bill in IT, it's Bill's MacBook Pro. In the Linux world, it's called a Baki, and it's not just restricted to Macs. If you have AirPrint compatible devices, the AirPrint drivers, or ZeroConf installed on your Linux machine, it will do this too. In Mac, and I think you can install this on Linux too, we have the dig command, which allows you to poke devices on the network and say, hey, what are you, and do you have this service? So you can just go down the list of IP addresses and poke each one. And most of the time, you know, IPSs don't care about you doing this because that's normal activity. You randomize it a little. So we find a few Windows and Mac devices, but that's a pretty broad scope, so we need to make a short list of targets to attack. we can use Nmap to find the leased IPs and ArcScan to find the corresponding MAC addresses. The reason we care about the MAC addresses is because if you have the MAC, you can look at the first couple bytes and figure out who manufactured it. And this is useful because up until recently, Apple used Broadcom network cards. So if it was running Bonjour and it had a Broadcom network card, you know, more and more qualifiers to give you intel. And then we can use that to reduce the amount of dig queries we have to do on the network for more stuff. And in particular, we found a MacBook Pro with the name of their IT admin on the network. And it gets better because he had SSH enabled. Yes. So after we did our Nmap scan, we found the usual stuff on the network, but in particular, we found password authentication was enabled.
It was not
I ain't gonna tell you what it is, but. So, we gave Hydra a go at it, and we harvested the username from the company email format and the host name of the device, confirmed it with an SMB share that was not properly locked down. So we could do user discovery on that share, just to confirm. macOS is really cool in that it gives you 10 simultaneous unauthenticated SSH sessions at once. I think Linux restricts you to 6, most distros do, which more or less doubles the speed of a brute force against a Mac, so long as you can maintain a stable connection. So, 14 hours and about 500,000 password guesses later, we got in. So issuing an ifconfig command from that Mac revealed that it did have multiple interfaces, wired and wireless, which was really useful to us. So the next step was going to be then, we need to pivot off of that device, and we want to do it quietly. Sure, you could use Metasploit out of the box and then just bounce things off of it, but that's loud. As useless as Fortinet devices are, they will freak out if they see you doing this. So you can actually tunnel other protocols through SSH. So we set up a tunnel, RDP'd, bounced it off, and then back to the domain controller. And go figure, you know, his credentials on the DC, the exact same as his laptop. Yeah. So we get to the domain controller, and you know, it's pretty much game over at that point. You don't need to continue the engagement, you've made your point. But I have a really good working relationship with this person, so I figured, well, why don't we mess with him a little bit? I think, yeah, you two were at my talk. You can play audio out of a Mac's speakers through the command line. Yeah, you can also change the volume level from the command line. So, macOS also has a built-in VNC server that you can enable from the command line. So we did. And we, you know, move around his mouse, rearrange some stuff, change his wallpaper. And then we also set it so every time he logs in, it plays the air horn and Mac's talking to him. And then we just reboot the machine and wait for him to log back into it. And about 30 minutes later, we get a phone call from him asking if we're done. Yeah. But all fun and games until you're on the receiving end of it. And then it really sucks. We know how we can leverage this and what tools we can use to carry out these attacks, but how do we stop them from doing it? Besides the obvious stuff, right? If your network is relatively static, you should be disabling dynamic trunking. There's no real reason to have it on if you're not adding or removing stuff from the network. Disable unused ports and set in-use ports to access mode only. I would also recommend that you use MAC filtering because, and I've seen this, they have an IP camera outside the building. It's not locked behind anything. And I'd love to just reach up and just pull on the wire because if it's long enough, you can pull down the Ethernet cable and just plug it in. And if they aren't using MAC filtering, you are now on their network. Easy peasy. So some routers, like I mentioned earlier, have the ability to set IP traffic rules. So when layer 2 controls fail, it will flag it as suspicious and block it. And always be on the lookout for dual interface devices, especially if they belong to privileged users on your network. Specifically, I would like to point out that Macs have the ability to intentionally bridge networks. If a Mac has a wired network connection, you can turn on Wi-Fi sharing so that other devices can just connect through that Mac onto your network, and your security controls no longer apply because they can choose whatever crappy password or none that they want for that ad hoc Wi-Fi access point. And you're not gonna notice that they're doing it. The only relatively consistent way I've found is that the time to live gets incremented when they're doing this. If something is connected through it, because it's not a great indicator. Yeah. If you can disable this via profiles, or if you're in the Windows world, group policy, definitely make sure you do. Windows can do it too. It's under a different kind of name and it's buried in control panel, but it is there. And if it is in the GUI, you can probably automate it too. So we made an app that makes it easier for human beings to avoid network bridging. We call it BridgeBlock. That's what it looks like. So you don't have to use a host name on the internet. You could point it at a IP or host name on your LAN, something that you know that it shouldn't have access to, or should, based off of its position in the network. And it will ping that every configurable number of seconds. If it finds that two interfaces are able to reach the same host, it shuts down them. And that can also be configured. By default, we turn off the wireless. You have the GUI version. There's also a command line version. So if you wanted to push this out to devices, just run it in the background. That is also an option. And as a bonus, if you disconnect the wired interface, it brings the Wi-Fi back up. I have pre-compiled versions thrown up on GitLab under the releases. I know people hate scanning QR codes at hacker meetups, but it's there if you want it. Also giving away copies of my book, so you could burn it, or I don't know, draw funny faces on it. But it's free, so if you want them, you can use the other code too. So, any questions about that?
What's back to the admin? So it's password reuse.
Password reuse,
So
so
it's also privileged account. Was it different than the standard account?
he had a standard account on that DC, but I don't remember if he was even using it. I do know that when we tried the credentials, we had, I think it was Forest admin, so.
It wasn't the fact that it was using the network credentials, it was using the local reuse.
Well, I mean, I'm looking at it like this, and that's a good point, right? He did two things wrong, which ultimately led to his downfall, but we already had remote access to the device, so it was a matter of time.
Yeah.
We could have turned on the VNC and just screen capped it until he happened to do something that we could scrape his credentials from.
The keylogger or something.
Yeah, we could do that too. Oh, yeah, and I found that on Apple Silicon Macs and newer macOS versions, like the payloads and Metasploit don't seem to work anymore for that. So just FYI.
You know, sound like we need to update those models over time because a lot of them have broken.
Yeah, well, they need the maintainers for it.
Yeah.
At the same time, their Macs aren't impervious. They've got their bonehead moments, but
It's also kind of obnoxious trying to get like a VM to test with them.
It's hard to test. In practice, they're pretty locked down, so there are better targets to go after unless they're doing something like opening SSH. If they aren't doing the hard work for you, don't bother. Cool.
So that tool